So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding, redemptive goodwill toward all, which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be loved and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
The King Center's beloved Community Leadership Academy is excited about the opportunity to help students recognize and develop their potential to become nonviolent leaders in industries such as technology, innovation, business, and entrepreneurship. Students will have the opportunity to engage in networking opportunities with business professionals and representatives from the King Center, universities, Fortune 500 companies, and civic leaders who will empower today's youth with the skills to effectively implement Dr. King's philosophy and methodology of nonviolence. The beloved Community Leadership Academy is committed to developing the next generation of compassionate, courageous, and conscientious nonviolent leaders to solve pressing world issues. For more information and to apply, please visit www.thekingcenter.org/Leadership Academy.
Hello, everyone. I am Tim Wise, an anti-racism activist, educator, and author of 9 books on race and racism in America. It is my honor and privilege to be with you this evening. Thanks to all the folks at the King Center for involving me in what I hope will be an excellent, and I expect will be an excellent conversation about the issue of the Great Replacement Theory and white fear. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a second, but I want to set up the conversation and the dialogue for you a little bit so you understand what it is we're talking about. You've probably heard the term Great Replacement or replacement theory before, but let's specifically understand that this is a theory that is linked to a number of terrorist incidents and mass murders, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. Most recently in Buffalo last month, the murder of 10 individuals, 9 of them black, in a black community in Buffalo, New York. Other terrorist attacks in Pittsburgh, in Charleston, South Carolina, with Dylan Roof, in El Paso, Texas, and also worldwide in Norway and in New Zealand in recent years. What is the Great Replacement Theory? First, let's understand that it is a conspiracy theory that says that white people, in particular in the United States and Europe, are deliberately, purposely being replaced and dispossessed by immigrants of color, by Muslim folk, particularly Muslims of color, and by refugees from quote unquote non-white countries, so as to diminish the power of white Christians and to enhance the power of those individuals who are doing the replacement. Now, for some who fashion this theory, those individuals are referred to as liberals or leftist or sometimes economic globalist. Others within the white supremacist movement are very specific about naming them as Jews, as some type of international global Jewish cabal seeking strength and power for its own group by diminishing the power of so-called white Christians. The most recent iterations of this thinking are what we have seen on display in these terrorist incidents, but in some ways, the notion of demographic replacement and the fear of that on the part of white folks actually goes back a long ways. It is the same kind of thinking that animated immigration restrictions in the United States in the 1880s, Chinese exclusion in the 1920s, immigration restrictions as well. So it has a long-standing history, this fear of the so-called black or brown other, the foreign other coming in and somehow polluting or changing either the biological or the cultural makeup of the United States and or in Europe, where the theory also has gained some purchase. But there is something specifically dangerous about it in this moment. Even though it has old roots, what makes the Great Replacement theory different from those previous xenophobic, anti-immigrant theories and beliefs of the past is that we are now in an era where the ability to spread that kind of conspiratorial thinking is much greater than it would have been even 25, 35, 40, or 50 years ago. The use of social media, the internet, ways of spreading these ideas very quickly before those of us who seek to challenge them have a chance to respond. So that makes it more dangerous. Secondly, we're actually in an era where there is a grain of truth to the thinking. And this is what makes it dangerous. There is, in fact, a demographic shift happening in the United States and in Europe. There's no question about that. The population percentages of white people are, in fact, changing. What makes replacement theory so dangerous is that it takes that grain of truth, right, which has very innocent, normal, everyday reasons, economic reasons, social and cultural reasons, and turns it into a conspiracy. The idea that it's not just that white folks are diminishing, it's that somebody, again, liberals, leftists, globalists, or perhaps Jews, are deliberately pulling the strings to make that happen. The reason that's so dangerous is once a person accepts that these demographic changes are the result of someone trying to harm you, or as Tucker Carlson has said on his program, where he's talked about the Great Replacement 400 times, according to a New York Times analysis, he says they're trying to hurt you. They're trying to kill you. Once you believe that, once you believe that it's not simply the ebb and flow of migration or economics or differential birth rates caused by different ages, the white population being older and having fewer children as a result of that, black and brown folks being on average younger and therefore more likely to have kids. Once you reject the innocent explanation and ascribe this shift to some pernicious or evil intention, all bets are off, right? At that point, it's kill or be killed. That's the thinking that we saw in Buffalo. It's the thinking that we saw Dylan Roof in Charleston manifest, that Robert Bowers in Pittsburgh, who attacked a synagogue there, manifested. It's the thinking of the mosque shooter in New Zealand, who had the very same kind of thinking in his quote unquote manifesto. So it's an old way of thinking. It's a long-standing xenophobic racist tradition, but it is especially dangerous in the current moment. And I want us to talk a little bit with our guest this evening about why it is so dangerous, why they, as former members of white supremacist, white nationalist hate groups, may have been susceptible to this kind of thinking. Because the hope is if we can figure out what it is that leads people to fall into this kind of thinking, what it is that leads people to be susceptible to this kind of hateful thinking, then at least in theory, we can begin to push back against it. So we're going to talk about that this evening. What leads a person to accept replacement theory and then not just accept it, but then act out on the basis of it, potentially in a violent or terroristic way. So I want to now introduce our guests for the evening, Arno Michaelis and Scott Shepard, both of whom I have known in the case of Arno for many years. And in the case of Scott, we have communicated electronically, but have never really had the chance to speak until this evening. So let me introduce them one at a time to you. First, Arno Michaelis. In the late 1980s and early 90s, Arno was a leader of a worldwide racist skinhead organization and the lead singer of a hate metal band, Centurion, which sold 20,000 CDs by the mid-90s and is still very popular with racists today. Luckily for Arno and for the rest of us, single parenthood, love for his daughter, and the forgiveness shown by people that he had once hated all helped to turn his life around, bringing him to embrace diversity and practice gratitude since he left the movement. After spending over a decade as a successful IT consultant, he's now a speaker. He's the author of My Life After Hate. He's the co-author of the book, The Gift of Our Wounds, and shares his ongoing process of character development as an educator working with Serve to Unite, S2U, which was founded as an ongoing response to the August 5, 2012 Sikh temple shooting in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, which I should point out was also motivated in part by the kind of thinking, replacement theory thinking, that we'll be talking about this evening. You can learn more about Arno at mylifeafterhate.com. And our other guest for the conversation this evening, Scott Shepard, is a former racist and member of the Klan who is now on a mission to stop racism and hate by educating young folks, sharing his life experience as a former racist activist. Using that knowledge and experience to help prevent the spread of hate, Scott believes that opening up dialogue and awareness is an important tool for preventing young people in particular from being targeted for recruitment into these groups. He is a race relations consultant, documentary film contributor, and activist who travels nationally and abroad in the hopes of improving race relations. So I'd like for us all now to welcome Scott and Arno to the conversation this evening. It's good to see you guys.
Thanks, Tim. Likewise. I appreciate you being here this evening, and grateful to everybody at the King Center for making this happen.
Absolutely. Let me jump in, and I want you to take turns on this. We'll start with you, Arno, and then Scott. The first question, just a very basic one for the audience as we think about replacement theory to consider. Why do you think this idea of demographic change in the U.S. and in the larger quote unquote Western world is so frightening to so many people that it becomes potentially an effective recruitment tool? What is it about that scares folks? Let's start with you, Arno, and then we'll go to Scott.
I think human beings across the board have a natural apprehension with any sort of change happening, especially when you feel that things are out of your control and you can't do anything about your situation changing. I also think that in this time, as you mentioned, at the technological point we are, changes not only in demographics, but in economy and what work looks like, what healthcare looks like, education, what have you. All that change is accelerating exponentially every day. So as fast as it goes faster and faster, it becomes more and more uncomfortable for people. And we also have a tendency to look back on history with kind of rose-colored glasses, going, oh, wasn't it? My mom is 77. She's a wonderful woman, and she always will sit there and go, oh, when I was a little girl, everything was so wonderful. We could play outside, and all these problems that are very front and center today were unknown to her. And I have to remind her, like, Mom, when you were a kid, black people were being lynched once a week, and they couldn't vote, and all sorts of other horrible things were happening. So we need to have that perspective about the historical myopia that happens. And beyond that, I think the reason why white nationalists successfully prey upon this is because they use it as a point to instill fear. Without fear, white nationalism or any other violent extremist ideology can't function. So any opportunity to cultivate fear is one that ideology is just kind of innately going to pounce upon. And as you mentioned, with this long list of terrorists who use replacement theory to justify the atrocities they committed, it's happening in an increasing frequency.
Let me first off, I'm looking over at the chat. It looks as though perhaps Scott is having some issues with audio. Scott, can you hear me? Not sure. Okay, well, we're trying to work with Scott. I'm going to continue with Arno for a second. Let me sort of ask a little bit of a follow-up. What is it when you were young and more impressionable? We're all impressionable despite our advancing age, but when you were young and came into this movement, to what extent did the organization or the movement that you joined and the individuals that you joined use this kind of fear of outsiders, of cultural and demographic change as a recruitment tool? And how much, if any, did that kind of thing play in your being brought into this particular movement?
It's important to understand that when I got involved in white nationalism, I was a drunken hooligan looking for justification for violence that I already engaged upon. It wasn't until I was associated with the movement for 6 months to a year that I really started assuming the white racial identity. When I grew up in a fairly well-to-do suburb, predominantly white, but a lot of Jewish people lived there. I had friends who were Afro-American or Asian or Latino. I didn't really feel a group identity according to the lack of melanin in my skin until I bought into white nationalism, which told me that my complexion made me different than everyone else, superior to everyone else, to the point of being able to dominate the world, and at the same time threatened by everyone else. And in the city I grew up close to, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, it's one of the most segregated cities in the United States for many, many years running, which was created by government policy back in the mid 20th century that said, if you're Afro-American, you can live here, but you can't live there. And this happened all over our country. It created hyper segregation. And with that segregation came poverty, came addiction, came crime. And so people outside of that segregation would see the inner city and be terrified of it.
Yeah.
And that segregation allowed you to have that separation of say, oh my God, that's what happens when black people are in a neighborhood. And I'm white actually, so I'm threatened by those black people.
That's a really important point, because what it suggests is that, I mean, two things that you said struck me. One is that your initial foray into this movement had very little to do with the ideology. It was more about belonging. It was about finding a crew, really finding a family, a connection. Same mentality that leads other folks to maybe join gangs or other types of organizations. It is really not about ideology. It's about closeness, connection, which makes it especially dangerous because everyone's looking for that, right? So it's easy for people who are otherwise decent to fall into those patterns. The second thing, when you pointed out the structural injustice of government enforced segregation, once the government has done that and kept us apart, naturally, what that does is it leads you to think, well, if those people are over there and they're not over here, it must be because they're bad. Because if they weren't bad, they wouldn't be over there, right? If they were good, they'd already be my neighbor. They'd already work next to me at the office. Their kids would already be in school. So there's almost like, and even among people who are not hateful and bigoted, right, this tendency to default to a certain amount of fear, which then those organizations can come behind and say, see, we have a theory to explain all of that. So it starts to make a lot of sense. Scott, can you hear us? And if so, can you hop in and talk a little bit about your thoughts on this?
Yes, I can hear you, but if you could preface it a little bit, I lost sound, and the first part I didn't catch.
So the question that I had asked Arno that I wanted to follow up with you on is, why do you think, and you can answer either of these, actually, I'll mention both of the ones that I asked him. One is, why do you think the fear of demographic and social change, which is part of the replacement theory, is so scary to so many people? And then secondly, to what extent did the organizations that you belong to and the movement when you joined it play on those kinds of fears as a way to recruit you? How central was that kind of fear in bringing you into the movement? Either or both of those that you'd like to talk about.
Well, I grew up in a segregated society, and I think I really didn't have any idea, the replacement theory actually wasn't called it, and I'm glad they've come up with a term that would cover the entire issue. But I was looking for a place to fit in, came from a dysfunctional family, and I just found it right, in the white supremacist movement. And of course, after getting in the white supremacist movement, I was taught a lot of things that I really didn't feel. And of course, the replacement theory, went back a long time ago. And I think it basically, like you said, fear. I think the fear of losing power, losing exactly, their way of life.
Absolutely. When you joined, as I recall, I think we spoke electronically years ago, and you mentioned to me not only your former Klan membership, but I think you mentioned, Scott, that you had been a member of the organization that David Duke founded when he left the Klan, the National Association for the Advancement of White People. Am I remembering that correctly, or is my brain?
That's
Okay.
correct. And also,
As I remember, as I remember, Duke, we're getting an echo, and I apologize for that. I recall reading in the newsletter that Duke put together for that, because David, for those who don't know the iterations of this movement, David Duke was someone who for years saw it as his goal to really sort of Nazify the Klan, to really take the Klan in a direction where they focused as much as possible on Jews as sort of the instigators of all of this evil. And in the NAAWP newsletter, I remember reading, part of my job for a while, not that this is a job anybody should want to have, but part of my job was literally reading everything David Duke had ever written or published. And he had a lot of stuff in there about the immigration changes, the birth rate differences. It was really the first time that I saw that. So how much of that do you feel during your time in the movement do you feel was central to their organizing? And then I guess the follow up to that is, what is it ultimately that led you, despite having been brought in to that way of thinking in one form or another? And then after you answer, Arno, I want you to take a shot at this too. What is it that finally got you to break out of that thinking? Because it seems to me that once you go down that rabbit hole of conspiratorial thinking, whether it's white supremacy or QAnon or, the earth is flat, I mean, like whatever it is, right, is really hard to pull out of because you're already engaged in such cognitive dissonance. So Scott, what is it that got you to think, wait a minute, this is not working for me anymore? How did you break free from that?
Well, I broke free from it because, actually I was raised by a black lady, and in Mississippi, and of course, she was like a family member. She took care of my mother, my brother, my sister, myself, and there was always this little, voice in the back of my mind that, am I doing the right thing? And I think I read something of yours that you thought that a lot of the people in the white supremacist movement really didn't believe the things that they were, promoting themselves. Am I right? I've lost you. Oh, there you go.
My feeling was that a lot of folks were like Arno, who initially came into the movement for reasons having to do with, as you both mentioned, sort of family situations that were dysfunctional. In Arno's case, sort of being as he said, a hooligan who was looking for a way to justify the stuff he was already doing, looking for a crew, and all of a sudden now you're brought in and somebody gives you the glue, to sort of keep you bound to that. You didn't come in looking for the glue. You came in looking for buddies and beer and some fist fights maybe, or you came in just for whatever, or maybe you come in, some people came in for the music, like what Arno produced for quite a while. And then once you're there, right, there's this glue that's given to you that makes it all make sense. And so it's interesting, Scott, that you mentioned that early formative experience of being raised by a black woman, because it seems like in a sense you were always battling against this newfound identity. Like it wasn't something that you were raised with. It wasn't something that you were taught in a direct way, the way that sometimes we think about, right? And Arno, I know a little bit about your story, but share with us and those who don't know it, what is it? I know obviously when you had a child, as any of us who were parents, I think can attest, changes your view about a lot of things. What were a couple of things that made you figure, hey, wait a minute, I gotta rethink this and go in a different direction and break free from that kind of thinking?
The simple answer is exhaustion. It's exhausting to live when you assume an ideology as your identity, and that ideology being first and foremost race, and then a white supremacy built upon that race ideology that is wrong. That in your heart is not the way to live. As I said, neither of my parents are remotely racist. I wasn't, and me being the contrarian punk that I am, had my parents been racist, it would have guaranteed that I would not have been.
Right.
But
Right.
when you are terrified of all the other human beings on Earth, which again, if you're not terrified every waking moment, you're not going to be able to maintain these house of card ideologies of violent extremism. It doesn't function. So I had to work to keep myself terrified. And as I'm doing this, I was extremely fortunate that many things fell into place. One was becoming a single parent. The other being that my parents never gave up on me. As horrified as they were at my behavior and my beliefs, they always let me know they loved me and they wouldn't give up on me. But one of the most powerful aspects was when people I claimed to hate treated me with kindness and compassion rather than hostility, which is always what I was trying to provoke. I wanted violence. I wanted people to swing at me. And whether I got the snot beat out of me or I beat the snot out of someone else didn't matter. What mattered was that violence happened. So when I had people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Afro-American and Latino coworkers say, no, we're playing by my rules. And my rules are, this is how a human being treats another human being. That connection of humanity, it showed me a glimpse beyond the racial lens that I had to work very hard to try to see the world through, to let me know that I'm a human being first and foremost. And just experiencing those glimpses of human connection added to the exhaustion to the point where I couldn't keep it up any longer. And that's what led to me leaving hate groups in 1994.
Yeah. Scott, talk a little more about that if you could. Share other aspects. I think you wanted to get in on that, and I didn't mean to cut you off. Are there other aspects of what brought you out of the work that you think are important for people to know?
Well, you're right. I went in and it wasn't, it wasn't that I really hated a lot of people. I was looking for a family to fit in with and people to, that cared about me. And of course, they really didn't care about me. They were using me. But yes, I had twin boys and I also had a daughter at the time. And I lost complete relationships with my daughter for many years. She even got married, and I didn't even know it and even had a baby. I lost relationships with my sister for 10 years. And all these things, weighed in on me. And also, I was in Nashville one time and was in a restaurant and having a few drinks and having dinner and got in trouble with law enforcement, and that threw me into the court system. And I ended up going to Cumberland Heights there in Nashville saying, I'm going to get the paperwork and take it back to the judge and get these charges dropped, which also one was a weapons charge, and that's what I did. But when I went in that treatment center and I went in one person and came out another. I was, kind of like Arno, I was exposed to people of all different races, religions, sexual preference, and these people were showing me love and respect. And these were the same people that I was, spouting hatred and anger towards. And that was pretty much where the seed was planted. And like I said, it was just a series of things that went on that, put that seed in my mind and got me to thinking.
Well, let me ask you both, and I'll start with Arno and come back to Scott. What are some things that as white folks, we need to be thinking about when it comes to hopefully preempting this on the part of other white folks? I mean, it's, better late than never, I guess, to try to bring somebody out once they're in, but that's hard to scale, right? It's very hard to scale an effort to bring folks out. It's better if we can get to young people before they fall prey to the kind of thinking that animated the shooting in Buffalo or Dylan Roof in Charleston, et cetera. So what are some things that we as white folks in particular need to be thinking about our responsibility to sort of, reach our people, so to speak? What are some ways that you think we can begin to do that? And similarly, if there are things you think that we sometimes do in the name of anti-racism that don't work or that you see as potentially problematic, because it isn't just about what to do. It's sort of also, things that we need to think about maybe not doing. So we'll start with Arno and then go to Scott.
I I think the best way to begin answering this question is talk about the two-step process in creating a white nationalist. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, I'm talking to, I always call him Joe Pissed Off White Kid. That's my target recruit there. Step one is I need him to identify as white. And the fact is in the late 80s, early 90s, most people racialized as white who I talked to didn't identify themselves as white. They'd say, well, I'm American, you know, my grandpa was German, we're Catholic, or we're Lutheran, whatever. There's a host of identities that they meant a lot more to them than a racial identity. So I had to instill upon them, I said, no, you're white, whether you like it or not. Society deems you white, and the enemies of our people are going to deem you white. So you don't have a choice about that, white man. And I get him to buy into that step one, because if he doesn't, there's nowhere to go. You can't go to step two. And step two is once a person adopts a white racial identity, you make them feel persecuted and oppressed because of it. Thus, if we as a society now are saying, okay, you're white, you're black, you're brown, and then we're saying, and by the way, you're an oppressor, you're oppressed, you're a colonizer, you have privilege, you're fragile, you're toxic. We're essentially going through the exact same steps of recruiting white nationalists that I went through when I actively did such a thing. So I think it's very important to understand that race is about 400 years old. And race was concocted by racists in order to perpetrate racism. It wasn't like some neutral, objective fact of human existence that racists came along and exploited. It was a creation of racism. So I think group identities is a human thing. We have a tendency towards tribalism, and we need to be aware of that first off. That we all have a tendency to say, okay, these are my people, that's their people, and actively work to counter that. And I do that by saying, you know, I'm a human being first and foremost. And the reason why I'm outraged at the state of our society is because my fellow human beings have been denied their human rights for 400 years because of the color of their skin. And when you have that foundation of common humanity to care and to connect through, that's when change happens. I believe Black Lives Matter because Black people are human beings. They don't matter because they're Black, because they're brown, because I'm white. They matter because we're all human beings. And so I think we need to continually remind ourselves of that truth and work from that foundation in order to address the horrific suffering that race continues to cause in our society after 400 years.
So before I jump to Scott, if what I'm hearing is if I'm hearing it correctly, it sounds like you're trying to say we need to distinguish between challenging white supremacy, which is an ideology created for a very specific reason, and fighting white people, so-called. In other words, it's about seeing the system or the idea as the enemy rather than making that individual person called white the enemy, because that's what feeds the mentality of otherness that leads to this persecution complex. Is that?
That's a fair paraphrase of it for sure. I mean, that's the main point, but it's also about how we identify ourselves. The big thing is really simple. If my identity is human, I'm not going to be threatened by whoever's moving in next to me if they don't look like me. That's not. Whereas if I'm like, I'm white and they're Black and they're moving, you know, when I buy
well,
into
and in that case, the replacement theory would have no power over you.
Exactly. Yeah, you're kneecapping the replacement theory when you don't cultivate that white racial identity.
Right, because it doesn't matter who's here in our neighborhood or in our country. If they're here, they're Americans or they're humans or whatever they are.
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay, Scott, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, I think you summed it up when you said, you know, we're all Americans, and we're either here or we're there. You know, of course, this country and this world made up of people of all different races, and like Arno said, you know, just accept the fact that we are different. We're different races, and that's not going to go away. And we just have to accept that fact and, of course, educate ourselves with the different people to get along with them, get to know them and communicate with them. That's, I think that's one of the most important things that we're going to have to do.
Let me follow up a little bit with something that I think in the wake of Buffalo, a lot of us are thinking about, and really all of these incidents, or most of them, have been perpetrated by relatively young folks. Dylan Roof certainly was. Peyton Gendron in Buffalo certainly was. Patrick Crucius in El Paso, young as well. Robert Bowers in Pittsburgh, a little bit older. But there seems to be a very deliberate effort on the part of those who push the replacement theory and other aspects of white supremacist, white nationalist thinking to target younger and younger folks. We know that in the case of the Buffalo terrorist, he was live streaming his act on a video game platform. And I'm not, I haven't done video games since the early 80s, which was like before Mario had a brother, just to put that in some historical context, old school video games. So I don't know anything about these video game platforms, but apparently there is a very deliberate effort by certain folks in the movement to target not just 18-year-olds, who are, at least in the case of the Buffalo guy, he's an adult, young adult, but an adult, but targeting 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 10-year-olds, going on these platforms where folks are, playing with people, could be on the other side of the globe, I suppose, or certainly on the other side of town, and just sort of throwing in little nuggets of racist thinking, maybe some racial slurs, trying to desensitize people to that. So the question I have for you is, what do you think parents need to be thinking about? Because their kids are the ones playing. Back in the day, we used to play video games, and it was like my Atari was set up in my folks' bedroom, so they knew exactly what I was playing. If I'd been playing anything where this stuff was going on, they would have known. But nowadays, that's not always the case. So what do parents need to know? What do parents need to be thinking about when it comes to, sort of circumventing or preempting this kind of recruitment? Because I'm sure every parent, when this happens to their kid, they're like, but he was always so sweet and nice, and we didn't expect this, right? He didn't come out of the womb a Nazi. So what do parents need to know? We'll start with Arno and then Scott.
First off, I think parents have to have the tech savvy to be aware of what sort of connectivity we have here in the globe right now. As you mentioned, Tim, I'm in the same vintage as you are. My greatest Christmas in my life was when I was like 10 and we got our Atari 2600 console.
Right.
But video games nowadays, like you said, people are actively connected with people all over the world. And white nationalists, as well as other violent extremists, the so-called Islamic State, really kind of pioneered the high-tech recruitment and violent extremist ideology. And the kind of new generation of white nationalist terrorists make no bones about modeling themselves after the actions and the tactics of the so-called Islamic State. So I think parents need to, first of all, be aware that not just a phone or a tablet can make these connections, but an Xbox or a PS5 or whatever they're on nowadays with these kids that they're playing. But the video game platform is now a full internet-enabled connection that parents need to be as aware of as they are when they're sitting at an old school computer screen looking at the Internet Explorer. In a broader sense, and I realize this is like, some people aren't really happy with this answer and that it's a bit esoteric, but I once had a gentleman at a talk ask me, he basically said, I got a 3-year-old little boy, and what can I do to make sure he doesn't grow up like you were? I'm happy you be how you are now, but I don't want him to go off the rails like you did. And my answer is model genuine happiness for that child. Work to practice kindness and gratitude and forgiveness and make them part of your day-to-day existence and embody those qualities in everything you do. Because when you create that kind of environment and you model happiness for a child, they're going to understand that everybody wants to be happy, and they're going to follow that example. And the best defense against violent extremism is to cultivate a healthy sense of self-worth, a sense of happiness, a sense of inner peace. If somebody has those things, no matter what they're connected to or what they're doing, they're not going to be susceptible to whatever violent extremist ideology they may come across. Whereas if a parent is kind of disconnected, and it's heartbreaking and it's all too common, and I can relate. My kid was little, like in the 90s, and I'd be like, go play your Nintendo or whatever. But nowadays we're just handing kids screens and going about and looking at our screens, and this like disconnect on top of disconnect on top of disconnect is what makes a child ripe for recruitment into not just violent extremism, but all sorts of other really destructive things.
I appreciate that answer. Scott, what do you think about that? What are some things parents need to be thinking about with their kids?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think Arno touched on it. Of course, the parents really need to be watching what these kids are playing on these Xboxes. I grew up in a time where we didn't have Xboxes or these crazy games, but I'm glad we didn't, because after I got into the movement and stuff, if I didn't have these inner doubts already getting into the movement and stuff, I could have myself could have ended up like Dylan Ruth. Could have been, just like him, but thank goodness I wasn't. But also mentioning, of course, the young kids being targeted like at 12 years old or so. I know some of these white supremacist groups that brought the kids in that are a lot younger than that. I'm talking about like 3 and 4 years old, and basically I think it's child abuse. And I think we really need to try somehow to fight this child abuse, as I call it, and stop it at the root.
Well, I appreciate both of your answers on that, and for all of your insights this evening. We're coming down to the end of our time, so I want to thank you both, and encourage all the folks who are on the live stream to check out both of your work. You've done some amazing things, and will continue to do so in the cause of racial justice and equity. Let me sort of close out with a few thoughts. I wrote a piece for Politico magazine early this month, or perhaps late last month, where I talked a little bit about some thoughts about things that I think are important that we as parents and as educators, whether it's in an actual classroom or just generally as parents trying to educate our own kids, need to be thinking about. As some of it, both Arno and Scott talked about. I want to add to that. I think we've got to, in our schools, begin teaching media and social media literacy at a very early age. The young man in Buffalo, for instance, was radicalized, or at least claims to have been, on 4chan, which is a message board that is used by a lot of extremists, a lot of folks in the misogynistic so-called incel movement, and others radicalize one another on there. So getting young people, before they get on those kinds of internet spaces, to be able to think critically about the messages that they're being given, to know, instead of looking at a meme online and believing it's true. Memes are not evidence. Memes are not footnotes. Memes do not show up in scholarly journals or books. And yet young people are being raised in meme culture. So teaching young people how to see through that, how to question it, how to do research. Everyone says, I do my own research, whether it's about COVID vaccines or about racism, but do they really? And do they really know how to do research? Or do they just type something into Google and the first page that pops up, that's what they look at? So number one is teaching folks how to actually do research and to challenge what they're taught. The second, and this is going to be hard because right now we have a lot of folks pushing back on the idea of any kind of anti-racist education, right? Folks in 15 states that have banned any real discussion of racism in the classroom as so-called critical race theory. But I think there's something we can do in spite of that pushback, and that we need to. And it's something that both Scott and Arno alluded to directly or indirectly. When you're a young person and someone comes to you and you have this desire to belong, and someone comes to you and offers you a narrative, one of the things that they say is, well, the Black folks stand up for themselves, So we should stand up for ourselves. And it sounds totally rational to that young person if they don't know history, if they don't understand the difference between organizing to have a seat at the table, which is what Black and brown folks have been doing, versus organizing to keep the table to yourself and kick everybody else out of the dining room, which is what white supremacy is seeking to do. It's very different. But if I'm 14, I don't know that difference. If I'm 16, I don't know that difference, right? And so part of what I think we also ought to be doing in our schools is giving young white people different role models, right? Different ideas of what it means to be in this skin, right? The idea that, you know, in the pushback on anti-racist education, the folks on the right are saying, well, if you teach them about racism, it makes white people feel guilty. The only way you would feel guilty is if you're learning about the wrong kind of white people, right? If you were learning about Arno and Scott, if you were learning about those white folks who joined the civil rights struggle, right? If you learned about those white folks who joined the abolitionist struggle, if you learned about those white folks who all through our history, going back to the colonies, there weren't enough of them. I don't want to give the wrong impression. There should have been a lot more. But if you learn about the fact that there have been white folks who went a different direction, then you can say to that young white kid, hey, look, there's a way to be in this skin that isn't about standing up for the white race, but that's about standing up for humanity, as Arno said. There's a way to do that. And others have done it. But if you don't know that history, because that's been left out too, it's not just that we don't talk about the historical contributions of Black and brown folks. We don't talk about white anti-racists. We don't talk about white folks who have tried to be allies and act in solidarity. If young people learn that, who were white, they might actually see that there's a different path to go down. So I want to leave you all with that thought as well. And I just want to thank everybody who came on the live stream. I want to thank Scott and Arno. I want to thank everyone at the King Center for the opportunity to talk with you all this evening. And I'm sure we all look forward to the next of the Beloved Community Talks. It's been a great series. I've been honored to be able to be part of a couple of them. Thank you all so much for being here this evening, and I hope you have a great rest of the evening. Thanks.